The Battle of Chickamauga was a 2-day conflict fought during the American Civil War in September 1863 between the United States Army, better known then as the Union or the North, and the Confederacy, better known as the South. The battle took place in southeastern Tennessee and northwestern Georgia, was fought for control of the nearby strategic railroad center, and involved approximately 60,000 troops from each side. The Battle of Chickamauga is well known for having the second highest number of casualties of the Civil War, second only to the infamous Battle of Gettysburg. For context, there were a total of 34,600 casualties and losses suffered by both sides in the Battle of Chickamauga, compared to Gettysburg's 50,000 casualties. Now, of the entire 34,000 casualties of the Battle of Chickamauga, one veteran in particular stands out as the most miraculous survivor of the bloody conflict. His name was Private Jacob Miller. Jacob Miller was originally from Naperville, Illinois. He enlisted in Logansport, Indiana, in 1861 at the age of 23 with Company K of the 9th Indiana Volunteer Infantry. Before the Battle of Chickamauga, Jacob and the 9th had actually already experienced their fair share of action at 3 other battles. These were the battles of Shiloh, Perryville, and Stones River. During the Battle of Chickamauga, Jacob and Company K found themselves right in the middle of the battle. There was shouting, screaming, gunshots, and bloodshed everywhere. Jacob was with his captain and several other company mates, and they had already fired off a few shots towards the enemy. As he was getting ready to fire his musket again, Jacob raised his arms, took aim at the enemy combatant, and all of a sudden he felt this intense pain in his head, and he was thrown backwards and fell on the ground. He was unable to move, and he couldn't even utter a word from his mouth. It was like all he could feel was pain, and his whole body just wouldn't do what he was trying to make it do. Turns out, Jacob was shot square in the forehead by an enemy sniper, right between the eyes. The sniper was actually aiming for Jacob's captain, but it shot Jacob instead. Jacob began to slip in and out of consciousness. The Confederate soldiers would begin to get the upper hand in the fight, and started pushing forward. The Union, including Company K, was forced back. Jacob's captain called for a retreat, and as Jacob faded in and out of consciousness next to him, Jacob heard the captain telling the others, "It's no use to remove poor Miller, for he is dead." So the entire company retreated from the area and left Jacob for dead. Jacob then completely blacked out. Jacob suddenly sat upright as he regained consciousness. His immediate sense was that of confusion, as he wasn't sure where exactly he was or what had happened. Something was wrong. He couldn't see anything. The whole world was a blur. But as he heard the distant sounds of battle, it all came flooding back to him. He began getting the immense pain in his forehead again, and used his hands to feel around for his injuries. He found his right eye was almost swollen shut, and that his left eye was popping out of its place, and that's why he could barely see anything. He was then shocked to feel a gaping hole in between his eyes. Through agonizing pain, Jacob pushed his crushed skull bones back together as he tried desperately to slot his left eye back into its socket. Eventually, he did manage to get it back into its proper place in his head. He then bandaged the eye as best as he could with his bandana. Now, Jacob had no way of knowing how long he had been unconscious, but it must have been some time, because he could hear the sounds of battle were now in the distance behind him. He instantly realized this meant that the Confederacy must have forced his friends in the Union to retreat, which also meant that Jacob knew he was now behind enemy lines. He had no intention of being taken prisoner, so he had to somehow find a way around the rear of the Confederacy line and back to his side. Although he was almost blind, could only see several feet in front of him using his swollen right eye, and covered in blood and in excruciating pain, Jacob managed to crawl over a few dead bodies, found his musket, used it as a support staff to slowly pull himself back up, then limped all the way to one of the flanks, and started making the slow 15-mile-long walk back round to the Union line. A mile or two into his slow trudge back, Jacob's body unfortunately was beginning to completely fail him. He had to use one hand to open the lids of his swollen right eye to even see. After another couple of miles, Jacob accidentally stumbled into a Confederate scout. Now, the soldier was surprised, of course, but after seeing Jacob with this huge hole in his head, blood all over his body, bandaged and swollen eyes, limping around with a musket for a crutch, the soldier took mercy on Jacob's plight. He gave Jacob a drink of water from his canteen and pointed him in the direction of the Union line. Jacob thanked him and continued on his way. Now, despite all this, after everything that's happened to him, Jacob amazingly somehow managed to get near enough to a Union encampment in a nearby small town. But just before he got there, his body had reached its limits. Jacob fell down and passed out by the roadside. But fortunately, a couple of nurses saw him, quickly got him on a stretcher, and brought him to the field hospital. Even though Jacob was now in the hospital with the kind of injuries he had sustained, he wasn't operated on or even seriously looked at by a doctor immediately. There were just too many wounded and dying soldiers. The next morning, as Jacob woke up, he could hear the sounds of artillery and musket fire not far from the encampment. The doctors came in and announced that the Confederacy was continuing with its forward advancement, and that everyone, including the patients, had to immediately evacuate further back to the nearby town of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Those who could not make the journey right now would have to risk being left here and evacuated by ambulances later. One of the doctors finally came over to inspect Jacob. He was aghast at Jacob's state. With the gaping hole in his head, blood everywhere, and eyes swollen the size of lemons, barely even able to open. Jacob pleaded with the doctor to remove the bullet still stuck in his forehead, but the doctor outrightly refused, afraid it might do more harm than good to remove it. The doctor deemed Jacob too wounded to retreat, so Jacob had to stay. Upon hearing this, Jacob was having none of it. He was still determined to not be taken prisoner by the Confederacy under any circumstances. So Jacob grabbed a canteen full of water from a nurse and walked right out the tent he was in. Well, more like limped out. Jacob made it a couple more miles, all the while using a hand to open his swollen right eye to see. Jacob was staggering along, bumping into low tree branches, tripping over the smallest of things, until his body could no longer take it. He collapsed by the roadside yet again. But fortunately, again, this time the train of ambulances coming from the encampment passed by. One of the drivers saw Jacob and asked, "Hey, are you still alive?" Jacob could barely manage a grunt in reply. The driver got out, picked Jacob up, and placed him in the back of the ambulance, and they drove off. 3 days after Jacob was shot in the head, he woke up and found himself in a long building that looked like a warehouse in Chattanooga, Tennessee, lying with hundreds of other wounded on the floor. Most of them were unconscious or groaning in pain. Then, Jacob heard some familiar voices talking not far from where he was lying. So he sat up and waved and called out to them. The soldiers looked over at him and at first were completely stunned. One of them said, "Is that Miller?" It was several of Jacob's comrades from Company K. They went over to Jacob and they all started talking. They couldn't believe Jacob was alive, let alone sitting there and talking to them with that hole in his head. As they were still chatting away, another soldier came in and gave instructions for all those who could still walk to cross the river pontoon bridge to the nearest hospital. So Jacob told his company mates, "Boys, if you can lead me, I can walk the distance." His friends thought his injuries had made him crazy, but Jacob eventually convinced them, and at sundown, all of them made the crossing together. On the other side of the river, Jacob and his wounded comrades met up with the rest of K Company. Jacob's captain couldn't even recognize him at first. No one could believe Jacob was alive, and right there in front of them. They gave Jacob and the others food. It was the first time Jacob had anything to eat since being shot. The next morning, a doctor came around to treat the wounded. Jacob begged the doctor to remove the buckshot still lodged in the hole in his forehead. The doctor was flabbergasted that Jacob was even still alive with an injury like that. But just like the previous doctor, he refused, afraid of possibly making the injury worse or outright killing Jacob. That day, all the soldiers had to make the 60-mile, 4-day journey to the town of Bridgeport, where they would then board the train to Nashville. During the long walk, Jacob's company mates supported him as best as they could. Jacob's sight in his right eye gradually returned to normal over those few days, so he could at least see where he was going now. After the train ride, Jacob was sent to the hospital in Nashville, then to the hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. then to the one in New Albany, Indiana. In every hospital Jacob was in, he would beg the doctors and surgeons to operate on his head, but every single one refused. Jacob had been suffering for 9 long months by this time, and had also completely lost vision in his left eye, the one that had popped out of its socket. Finally, after almost a year, Jacob was able to make his way back home to Logansport. He immediately visited his local doctors, who, unlike all the others he'd asked before, agreed to operate on him. However, they were only able to remove one of the several musket balls stuck deep inside Jacob's forehead. After Jacob's enlistment officially ended in 1864, he returned to civilian life with his open wound. 17 years after first getting his injuries, a buckshot dropped out of his wound. 31 years after that, 2 pieces of lead dropped out. Jacob lived for 64 years with that hole between his eyes that had penetrated his skull 3/4 of an inch deep. The hole itself was large enough to stick the tip of his finger in. Jacob became something of a local celebrity after the war, and he gained the nickname Center Shot. Jacob would say in his later years that he would constantly suffer from side effects such as intense head pains, confusion, dizziness, and delirium. However, Jacob had always maintained that no one was to blame for his misfortune, and that the government had always treated him right, and gave him a pension of $40 a month, which in today's money would be about $960 a month. Private Jacob C. Miller would later be awarded the Gar Medal, or the Grand Army of the Republic Medal. Jacob would go on to live until the ripe old age of 87, all the while with that huge hole in his forehead. Here are some pictures of Jacob Miller in his later years. And that's it for today. Thank you for listening to 15 More or Less. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy what we do here. It really helps our channel, and we appreciate it immensely. If there's a story you'd like us to cover, or have a story of your own you'd like us to share, you can email us or leave a comment below. I'm M15, thanks for listening, and see you guys in the next story.